can you imagine a time when guitar was considered the unquestioned champion of all instruments? When kings and queens played it and the greatest composers battled each other for who gets to write the next dedication? That's unfortunately too good to be entirely true, but we got close to it, and a big part of that story is about this man.
Among the guitarist composers, Sor stands out as one of the very best, and in my view, the best of his generation.
Sor's music really is excellent. It's dramatic, deeply emotional, expressive, and full of surprise. It's not only magnificent to the ear, but a real joy to play. I rarely find another composer for our instrument whose pieces are as satisfying to practice and perform.
His best music is a head and shoulder above the rest of the guitar composers of this period.
This is Erik Stenstavol, emeritus professor from the Norwegian Academy of Music and one of the foremost experts on the history of guitar, particularly on Sor. For this video, we talk not only about Sor and the exceptional time he lived in, but we're also getting crucial insights into understanding how to approach any sources on historical music, not only for guitar. If you want to see more videos like this, like and subscribe.
Through the centuries, the interest in the guitar has fluctuated, perhaps more than any other instrument. It has had its peak periods and its down periods. And one of the peak periods was the early 19th century.
When Sor was born, the guitar as a solo instrument was once again bubbling around in relative obscurity, being mostly ignored by the musical establishment. This is not to say that it was actually dead. It was kept alive as an amateur instrument, and there were pockets of professional activity in some of the larger cities in Europe. Around the end of the 18th century, we see the emergence of the first six-stringed guitars, the new standard that remains until this day. By the way, back then, a guitar was a guitar. No distinctions were made between classical and popular styles. The music for this video was recorded on this guitar, a detailed replica in the popular Stauffer style from Vienna. We're bridging the gap between the centuries a bit since I have synthetic strings on this, but you can still hear the silvery brilliance that's so typical for these guitars. Of course, Sor would have used gut strings, and unlike most modern classical guitarists, he would have plucked them without fingernails. More on that later. Exactly why is a subject of ongoing debate, but for a number of reasons in the first decade of the 1800s, this new style of early romantic guitar suddenly became super fashionable. This was heralded by the arrival of two Italian virtuosos, Mauro Giuliani to Vienna and Ferdinando Carulli to Paris. Within a few years, we went from almost nothing to something researchers around Stenstavol nowadays have dubbed the Great Vogue.
Carulli came to Paris and he became a very big star, and a lot of other guitarists came to Paris. Paris was in many ways the center of the guitar in Europe at that time. There was also a report in Paris in around 1820 that you could really hear guitar being played everywhere in all quarters.
In comes Fernando Sor. Born into a Spanish upper-middle-class family, he received formal musical training in childhood, and he was always a musician by passion. But music was not for making money, so he worked in administration as one ought to do. First, actually in a playing card factory, later as a police commissioner for Napoleon's occupying forces. After this occupation ended in 1813, his acceptance of the more liberal French regime was harshly punished by the conservative monarchy in Spain. This changed everything for him.
Sor, with tens of thousands of other Spaniards, they had to leave the country because they had cooperated with the French. So Sor never came back to Spain after that.
Suddenly, Sor had to make money with his music. and he had great ambitions.
He wanted to be not a guitar composer, but an opera composer, which he did not succeed to do. But he had quite success in writing ballet music. And his first success as a ballet composer was with the Cendrillon or Cinderella, which was performed first in London in March 1822.
Although the critics were divided on the newcomer, Sor's ballet was a big success with the audience, and it was played over 100 times in the great theatres all over Europe. Sor experienced firsthand what was possible, but he couldn't repeat the success, and after a few years in London and Moscow, he returned to Paris. Again, he tried to establish himself as an opera composer.
But there was no response to that. His style was too old-fashioned and too Italianate for the French fashion at the time. He had to become a guitarist full-time and compose only for the guitar the rest of his life, it seems. The problem with the guitar was that in a way it was an amateur instrument, and amateurs wanted music that was simple for them to play. Sor, like several other guitarists, wanted to elevate the guitar and establish it on the same level as other instruments. Music for a guitar shouldn't be cheating the musical rules. But this made his music in many ways difficult to play. He composes church music, they said, give us guitar music. And on the other hand, there was this problem that the musical establishment, although they acknowledged his great talent and that what he did on the guitar was absolutely astonishing, they still said that why do you play this instrument? Why don't you play a proper instrument where you could really develop your talent so much better?
Sor obviously loved the guitar, but the guitar was belittled by established musicians. Many of them deemed its sudden popularity to be no more than an annoying fad that will soon go away. At the same time, Sor composed with the musical mindset of these established musicians, but many of his fellow guitarists did not understand or want this. He was bitter, and for good reason. But yet, he still composed, and we can consider ourselves very lucky for this fact. More than half of his works for guitar were written in the last 10 years of his life in Paris, some of them of transcendent quality. His very last composition for solo guitar, the Fantaisie Élégiaque, Opus 59, is one such gem.
This music is really full of heartfelt agony, sorrow. It starts off with really a cry of agony. I feel this diminished chord that it opens with in the forte. It's one of Sor's most romantic pieces, and he uses melodies that goes up and down all the time. Techniques that much more we think of as typical of the more romantic guitar composers. A lot of glissandi and portamenti. It is an absolute beautiful piece of music.
The piece is dedicated to Charlotte Belay, a student of Sor that died in childbirth, and Sor's immense grief over this loss is palpable. As modern guitarists, how do we approach this music? Let's say I want to learn Sor's famous Mozart variations, Opus 9, one of his most popular evergreens, and for good reason. It's played so often, finding good sheet music should be straightforward, shouldn't it? If you try to search for it online, you're instantly presented with a plethora of options. You will quickly notice that there are sometimes significant differences between these. You read some blogs, discussions. People mention older sources, facsimile editions. This must be it. After all, the further back in time you go, the closer you will get to the composer, no? Nope. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. At all. As it turns out, even decades of research can lead you into dead ends. With this seemingly simple task, it's truly astonishing.
Everything is depending on who edits it. Even the composer's original handwriting It's not the thoughts of the composer we have there. We have his handwriting, and then the next step is the addition and the new addition, and in between there are layers of interpretation by editors and engravers. Now everybody is using urtext editions, but don't trust them, I say. Don't trust urtext editions. Don't trust any edition. Not even mine.
In the first half of the 20th century, most of the time publishing houses would ask famous virtuoso performers to provide editions of historical music. This happened across all instruments, and the result were editions that mirrored how the particular virtuoso played a piece. This is, by the way, entirely okay, but it's important to understand the distinction. Starting in the 70s, we witnessed the advent of these so-called urtext editions that claimed to have a more falsifiable research foundation beneath their editing decisions. This claim was sometimes true, but unfortunately not always. Professor Stauffer has been researching Sor's music for many decades, and he says that it took him a long time to untangle the complex web of sources surrounding the repertoire. All of this research resulted in a new and complete critical edition that lays out the entire editorial process in painstaking detail, explaining every single of his considerations for all of Sor's known guitar compositions. Still, even with such broad knowledge, many of his editing decisions are just educated guesses, and for us as musicians there is no way around understanding and maybe refuting these guesses for ourselves.
The problem with Sor's music, it's preserved only in the shape of the published editions from his own time, with all the faults they may have. It's very important then to make a decision which of these printed editions is the one Sor may have had a hand in. The problem with Sor is that he didn't seem to be very concerned with misprints in the editions.
One point of contention in Opus 9 is the slurring of certain voices in the theme and some of the variations. The main historical sources for this piece are two French editions by the publishing house Messiaen and one so-called London edition. The first Messiaen edition leaves out one variation and orders the rest differently. This led some guitarists to the conclusion that the London edition must be the authoritative version, since it was published earlier than the second Messiaen edition. The London edition, however, does not have legato bows, which significantly changes the feel and fluidity of the piece. Some players actually embrace this, but my personal hunch aligns with Stauffer's opinion, and it's entirely possible that none of the early editions fully reflect Sor's true intention. Anyway, did the composers of the time even think in such rigid dimensions? The legato? Probably yes. In general, probably not.
We know that Sor played the Mozart variations in concerts over several years. I'm sure he didn't play it the same way the second time as the first. That would be very strange.
How to play this music? Well, now we're opening the biggest can of worms. Just a very quick rundown. One could talk for days about this. There is no early music police and many approaches are valid. But if we're interested in making this music work, I'd recommend at least being aware about Sor's own playing style. We already know the obvious things. Gut strings, historic guitar, no fingernails. Strings and guitar are expensive. If you have them, great. To me, playing this music somehow feels extra joyful on these instruments. To say it actually sounds better than on a modern guitar though, I'm not entirely sure. Lighter maybe? You certainly don't need to feel compelled to buy one just because you started playing Sor pieces. If you already play with fingernails, there's also no requirement to cut them off. However, the opposite is just as true. Playing with fingernails is not the inherently superior thing it's sometimes said to be. It's just the way most players prefer to do it nowadays. In the left hand, Sor wanted his students to play with great fluidity, making sure to keep all voices going as written, and many of his etudes train exactly that. Sor's right hand technique is peculiar. He avoids using the ring finger whenever possible and instead chooses to play with the thumb on the treble strings whenever needed. This is actually closer to how a lutenist would have done it than to the modern standard, but it can work just as well, and many people naturally struggle with the independence between ring and middle finger. Many modern guitar compositions might require the ring finger to be just as fast as the rest, but avoiding it for Sor's pieces might just automatically create the optimal pulse, maybe even just as intended by the composer. We will never know for sure, but it can sound really good. One last thing on posture. Sor, like all of his contemporaries, experimented with this. His personal solution was placing the guitar halfway on a table to give more freedom to the left hand. You don't need to do that, no worries. If you dislike the footstool, a guitar support will work just fine. One of Sor's best friends, Aguado, actually developed a complicated tripod guitar support system to address the issues guitarists had back then, just as they have them nowadays. And as it happens, in the foreword to the Fantaisie Élégiaque, Sor even endorses Aguado's invention. From our point of view, we like to think of Sor and the other guitarists of his era to be the starting point of a continuous evolution towards the modern age. We want to think they're the masters that laid the foundations for generations to follow, similar to how their contemporaries did it for piano and violin. However, this perspective massively underestimates how badly guitar as a solo instrument fell into obscurity after the Great Vogue ended.
In 1819, there is a report in a musical journal about the guitar and it says, "The guitar has already 1 foot in the grave." Legnani came to Vienna. The reports were that his playing was even better than Giuliani's. But they said nobody came to his concerts. The interest had completely faded. Even Sor had difficulties the last period of his life in Paris. He had difficulties in selling his music to the publisher.
The Fantaisie Élégiaque was written in 1836. Just 1 year later, Sor's own daughter died. Her Requiem was his last composition. Sick, embittered and depressed, he died in 1839. It would take more than half a century for the guitar to again come close to the popularity it had during the Great Vogue. Sor and his contemporaries had to be rediscovered, and this process of rediscovery is permanently ongoing. Big shout out to Professor Erik Stenstavol and his invaluable wealth of knowledge. If this video inspired you to conduct your own musical research, his articles and publications are an excellent starting point. I invite you to consider subscribing to Tonebase to get access to a massive catalog of masterclasses, live streams, guided practice plans, a thriving musical community, and much more. Of course, a large amount of our content is about Sor and his music, such as, for example, a brilliant masterclass on interpreting the Fantaisie Élégiaque by none other than Carlo Macchione. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave us a comment about your personal experience with Sor and his music. Also, we're close to 50,000 subscribers, so if you want to help us get over that line, a subscription would be greatly appreciated. See you next time. Cheers!